Hello and welcome to TalkNado, a new spin on politics. My name is John Gelsomino, and today we're going to talk about the 2016 presidential election. We have two outstanding guests with us. To my right is Ms. Jan Goldberg, a retired teacher from Riverside Brookfield High School. And to my left is political commentator and Republican strategist Chris Robling. Thank you both for coming here today.
I think you've got one outstanding guest, and I'm here too.
Well, thank you for having us. I'm honored to be here.
Excellent. Let's get right to it. Mr. Robling, it's been an interesting year for Republicans, and yes. And with that, I'm going to start off with a tough one. Do you support Donald Trump?
What's your second question? What is the second question? Yeah, I'm not a big Trump guy, and I wasn't a Trump guy in the primary, and I haven't been going around urging people in Illinois to vote for Trump. On the other hand, I recognize that he is the candidate of our party, and that he has been duly nominated, and that he won fair and square. And so, I became a Republican in about 1976, which might sound like a long time ago for some people, but anyway. So it's the first time that I've been ambivalent about a Republican presidential candidacy.
Interesting. And Ms. Goldberg, that's a typical response from many Republicans.
It is.
Ms. Goldberg,
absolutely is.
Secretary Clinton has been in the public eye for almost 25 years.
She has, since 1992.
First Lady, served as Senator from New York, Secretary of State.
That's correct.
Why are her unlikability numbers still so high?
I wish I knew. I think it has to do with her past. People in my generation were upset that she, quote, stood by her man, when many women of her ilk, if that's the right term, would have left him in a heartbeat. But far be it for me or the rest of America to judge what goes on inside a marriage. So I do believe that's one reason. And then I think they looked at her as kind of a carpetbagger in the early 2000s, when she moved from Washington, D.C. to New York State. But she became a fine senator. I mean, she was reelected, so the people of New York State must have seen something in her that was positive. And then when she was Secretary of State and used that server, that private server that Bernie Sanders said, get off her damn emails about, and I don't know, I think people don't trust her on the little things. She had pneumonia this weekend. She didn't want to tell the world about it. So people don't trust her for some of the little things, and people think, well, if you lie about little things, what else are you holding back? She's not warm and fuzzy. She's not as good a campaigner as her husband, but I do believe if elected, she will be every bit as good a president as he was.
One of the concerns for her campaign is getting the Senator Bernie Sanders supporters to get behind her and vote. How does she do that when a lot of his supporters really haven't seemed to want to jump fully on board?
Well, they do that by explaining what's at stake in this election. You have Republicans that can't get behind Trump because he's such an outlandish character. And she also does it by doing what she did. She had Bernie come and stump for her. I said Trump for her. Stump for her on various sites, and I think his supporters need to look at her past and look at her accomplishments. And if you look at her accomplishments even from the 70s, when she was a lawyer in Arkansas, the things that she has worked for her whole career, it made me warm toward her. And of course, I did not vote for her in any of the primaries. I did vote for her in 2008 and in 2016. I understand where the Bernie supporters were coming from. I think he had some excellent points, and I think he helped move her whole agenda just a little bit more progressive.
Mr. Robling, a year ago, August, the first debate in Cleveland, Brett Baer asked a question of the entire Republican panel if anyone had any reservations in supporting the nominee. The only person who raised his hand was Donald Trump. He's now the nominee. Is it hypocritical of people like Governor Kasich or Jeb Bush to not fully support the nominee of the party?
I have a hard time passing judgment on them because they had personal experiences with Donald Trump in that whole primary season. So they were on, 15 or something debates with him, and they were campaigning around all of the primary states. And I think they each have their own sort of background with Trump on which they're making those decisions. Trump has been a very unusual figure for Republicans to nominate. That's not to say he's completely alien to the Republican Party, but there are a lot of things that he says, like offending people and insulting people, that don't sound good to folks who care about the party reaching out. On the other hand, there are things that he has done. I think that the way that he has stood up against the status quo and the way that he has, in some sense, represented popular frustration with sort of, is the country going in the right direction or are we off on the wrong track? There's a pretty significant number that say wrong track. And I think that he has given voice to that. So Trump is really a mixed bag, and then him being a mixed bag evokes from people like the candidates with whom he ran in the primary mixed reactions. So some support him, like Chris Christie or Reverend Huckabee, and then Governor Huckabee, and then others don't, like the ones that you mentioned, John Kasich and George Bush. I'm sorry, Jeb Bush.
What does Trump need to do at the debates?
Beat expectations. I think that he has to come off as somebody who is serious about the presidency and serious about the substantial issues that get raised at the debates. And even more important than the ones that get raised at the debates are the substantial issues that Hillary Clinton raises and the substantial issues that he raises. So the debate is a time for him to show that he is a viable alternative for president.
We're just getting started here on TalkNado, and we'll be back with more presidential politic talk right after this. Welcome back to TalkNado with Chris Robling and Jan Goldberg. We begin segment 2, and Ms. Goldberg has a question of something that Mr. Robling said in our first segment.
Yeah, Chris, earlier you said something about Trump has brought out the frustrations that people have with the status quo. And you said he stood up against the status quo. Can you give an example of that?
Well, I think his whole campaign, actually. I think that Trump has styled himself as the non-status quo Republican, and then when he gets the nomination, he's running against the status quo of for instance, Hillary Clinton is the third term of Barack Obama, okay? And Hillary Clinton, just like Hubert Humphrey in 1968, just like I think Al Gore.
Bush number one in 1988.
Bush number one in 1988, but I'm looking at Hubert Humphrey as not having prevailed and at Al Gore as not having prevailed. And I think that Hillary has a tough assignment, and it's always a tough assignment, to run and to support your president, who actually Barack Obama's popularity numbers have been increasing lately.
They have.
But also to distinguish and to say, here's what I'm going to do, or here's what I'm going to do differently, or here's how we're going to make things better, okay? So I think that to the extent Hillary represents a continuation of the Obama worldview, Trump certainly stands in opposition to that. And I think that's why he has resonated, actually. That message reinforces his personal attribute of not being from the political system, of being a businessman, of being a real estate developer who, has sort of put that aside to go run for public office first time in his life. And he can say, I'm doing this because I'm so concerned about how things are going.
Yet he's trying to return us to a status quo of the 1980s of the Republican era, such as cutting taxes, such as cutting regulations. I mean, when you say status quo, I think that's a loaded term, because it depends who. People who go against the status quo are usually people that don't like the way things are going now, and they want to change things. And Hillary has distinguished herself in that she wants to take some of the best of the Obama presidency and expand upon that. Healthcare, for example, is just one example of some things in her campaign website that she wants to expand it further. And every time I see a policy statement come out of the Trump campaign, it reminds me of Ronald Reagan all over again. So in a way, he's kind of a reactionary to a time when people again were frustrated with the status quo. Reagan, definitely came in on a wave of discontent. But on the other hand, if he continues to talk as though he's going to shake things up and change everything, most of the ideas that I wrote down from his website, I've heard before, and they haven't worked.
I urge you to vote for Hillary Clinton.
You urge me to?
Yeah, because of your view.
Well, of course.
There you go.
Of course.
One of the issues that's come up in this campaign that I think each side has had an interesting response to is NAFTA. And former President Clinton obviously signed NAFTA in the early 90s. Has NAFTA helped or hurt our country, Ms. Goldberg?
Probably a little of both. I'm sure a little of both. I'm not an economist. I look at these trade agreements and I read them over and over again, and honestly, they're pretty complicated. I've read the TPP, and at first I thought it was toilet paper, and then I realized it had to do with the Pacific. And trade cuts both ways. If you erect high tariffs, you tend to live in kind of an isolationist bubble where your products aren't getting out there. And from what I understand, what Clinton was trying to do in the 90s was make us one hemisphere by having more products go back and forth, and probably having NAFTA lead to less immigration. Because if products go back and forth, there's less of a boundary between the countries. So has it hurt or helped? I'm going to say a little of both. And I'm sure that it could be looked at in more detail by somebody who is more economically well-versed than me. But I don't think you can throw out the baby with the bathwater. Trade agreements, well, they cut both ways. And lowering tariffs has the advantage of opening up your markets across the globe. And we are a global economy, so I don't see how we can get away from them.
Mr. Robling, helped or hurt NAFTA?
On balance, I think helped, but they bring up the question of how much they have also hurt, okay? And I think that this is a frustration that people have. And frankly, now we've got a little bit of confusion out there between Hillary and Donald Trump, because both of them are questioning what I would say is the post-World War II international economic policy consensus in favor of increasing trade, okay? Hillary helped negotiate the early stages of TPP that Jan's already referred to, and she called it in those days the gold standard. Now she has questions, and she's not entirely in favor, and it's going into Congress for final votes really in the next few weeks. And so she's in the question mark category on TPP. And Donald Trump has been saying that we haven't done a good enough job with our trade agreements to protect American workers and therefore American families and incomes. And so trade is one of these issues when you see difficulty in the middle class and the inability of the middle class incomes to rise significantly. We had a recent bump, but that's not yet.
I was just going to say, the papers reported yesterday that the median income has gone up at least 2 to 3% in the last year.
Well, yeah, there was a 5.6% jump reported 9 days ago, but that doesn't bring us back to where we were 9 years ago. So
before the recession.
It's good news. It's good news, but it's not great news. Anyway, trade is, as Jan says, very complicated. Both candidates are questioning the extent to which these agreements are helping us. And
you mentioned the World War II, post-World War II era. I mean, we came out on top in industry and everything else in World War II. Our products were the gold standard, you mentioned that, and the rest of the world really couldn't compete with us at that time. Our labor was the best, our products were the best, and we really didn't have a global economy then. And then that changed.
On that note, we need to go to break. We'll be back with more TalkNado after this. Welcome back to TalkNado. One of the big issues of this campaign that Mr. Trump has brought up is immigration. And this question goes to Mr. Robling.
Sure.
Mr. Robling, can Donald Trump build a wall?
Well, he's very good at building tall buildings, so who knows? Maybe he can. I don't know. If anybody can build a wall, Donald Trump can build a wall. Is he going to build the wall? I don't know. I think most people who study this realize that across the Mexican border, we've got a wide variety of climates and microclimates and landscapes, and in some places a wall is very important, and other places not so important. So I don't know what actually is going to happen. But I think that Trump's use of immigration to catalyze support in the Republican primary, and indeed in the general, is really not just about immigration, although it's very significantly about that, but it's also about the effectiveness of government. And it's about the extent to which people believe in their government or really think that the government is no matter who they vote for, no matter how much they pay in taxes, no matter who's in the White House, that there's just some sort of problem, that government can't solve a problem. And I think that he has so far effectively used immigration as an area in which to say, I identify with those concerns, and if you elect me, I will solve the problem. Now, what are the details on that? He did give a terrific speech. He went to Mexico. He met with the president of Mexico. People are going to have to judge for themselves if they want that approach or they want the Hillary Clinton approach. That's really up to them. But I think that he's no longer susceptible to the criticism of just being, headlines, just throwing out a headline about build a wall, the Mexicans will pay for it. He's now added substance to that, and it's going to continue to come up, especially in the debates. There's no question it'll come up in the debates.
Ms. Goldberg, what's Secretary Clinton's stance?
Well,
on
Secretary
the
Clinton
issue?
believes very strongly in compromise. And if you recall, in 2006, there was a bill that failed in Congress, and it was a beautiful compromise. The President Bush #2 was behind it, and it was called the McCain-Kennedy bill because each of those senators put it together and they reached across the aisle. And it was a wonderful compromise that fell a few votes short of passing. And had that bill passed, I don't think we'd be having the problem that we're having now. And it came up again in recent congressional votes, and it failed yet again. And the compromise in both times was to have some kind of amnesty for the people that have been here 5 years or more and have worked hard and do not have a criminal record, and that they would work toward first legalization and then toward citizenship, that they had to work toward citizenship. And that was kind of the plum to give to the Democrat side. On the Republican side, more money was going to be given to Border Patrol and for enforcement of our borders, closing up our borders and tightening up who gets in after this bill was passed. And you mentioned, Chris, when Donald Trump went to Mexico, you said he gave a great speech. He never mentioned the wall to the Mexican president. He talked really tough that same evening when he flew from Mexico City back to wherever he was in Arizona. And he gave a we're going to build a wall, and he's going to pay for it. He never even brought it up. And from what I saw in the news, the Mexican people were very upset that he came to their capital to talk about this, considering all his inflammatory statements that he had made in the past. And inflammatory statements, calling Mexican citizens rapists and everyone's illegal and horrible things that he said, does not endear anyone to compromise. And immigration has been a problem since 1924. And we need to compromise on it. And all three of us are children or grandchildren of immigrants. And to me, this was government at its best. Because if my grandparents didn't come when they did in around 1905, I certainly wouldn't be sitting here right now. That's a given.
I think we're going to agree to disagree, Jan and I, on this issue of what happened on that day in Mexico City, because there are a lot of reports about the president of Mexico raising the wall issue with Trump, that they did discuss it, and that it was the position of the president of Mexico, we, Mexico, will not pay for your wall.
That's right.
Okay, so that I do believe it did come up. It was discussed. I believe that Trump was upset about that. That's why he emphasized that they're going to pay for it. But in any case, it is both frustration with immigration and the lack of the federal government, or the inability of the federal government over years and years, and over both Republican and Democratic president, to get a handle on this. And it is a determination that the immigration crisis is a surrogate for a lot of discontent and distrust in government.
I would agree with you there that it is a surrogate for distrust in government, but it's also a distrust in leadership, I think, because Bush, too, had his party in both houses of Congress back when that Kennedy-McCain bill was put forward, and he could not get his own party to pass it for reasons I really don't know why, because it was an unpopular issue, I guess. People didn't want to legalize or set up a path to legalization for the people that came here illegally. Yet the very same people that voted against it, I'm sure if you trace their roots, probably have immigrant parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who came here at a time.
They may have followed the rules.
Well, there were no rules. Back
There have been
until
different rules.
1924,
Yeah,
there
right.
were no rules. This was an open
Right.
border. In fact, we begged people in Europe 100 years ago to come here to fill our factories. It was a very different time. But it's still hypocritical, I think, for children or grandchildren of immigrants to say, I'm here, you can't come. It's very hypocritical.
Do you see Mr. Trump backing off of what some consider a very extreme stance on this during the debates, or do you think he doubles down?
No, I think this is his position. I think it's been working for him. I think he's going to stick with it, and I think that's exactly what we saw when he gave the speech down in Phoenix. There was a little bit of moderation, but I would say a lot less than was expected. I think he's going to stick with it.
All right, we will be back with more of TalkNado right after this. Welcome back to TalkNado with Chris Robling and Jan Goldberg. We've been talking a little bit about the economy. We'll continue that with a little bit of talk about the national debt. It's over $19 trillion. Ms. Goldberg, what is Secretary Clinton going to do if she is elected president to break into and decrease that incredible number?
Well, we've had a national debt every year in American history, except I believe 3. One was in the 1800s during Andrew Jackson's administration, and 2 were fairly recently at the end of the Clinton administration. He had a surplus in '99 and in 2000. And some of that he was riding the end of the 90s .com boom. So a lot of income tax was coming in. Taxes were a bit higher in the 90s than they were a decade later. And Secretary Clinton's plan is to tighten up corporate taxes. Corporate taxes in this country are too high, and it does force businesses to hide their headquarters overseas. They might have a P.O. box in Switzerland. 60 Minutes did a piece on that not too long ago, where Leslie Stahl was looking for the international headquarters of a company, and she found this itty-bitty P.O. box in Switzerland. Others do it in Ireland and other European countries where they really don't have headquarters, so they're hiding their address in order to pay less taxes. So she's going to tighten up on that, and she also has something called an exit tax, that if a company wants to make their headquarters in another country, that they will have to pay for the jobs that they take with them. And I do believe that her income tax structure will stay the same as Obama's income tax structure. I mean, taxes are controlled by Congress, but her opinion on it is that lowering taxes just increases the deficit. And that's what happened in the 80s. I mean, I got a wonderful tax break in the 1980s. And did I spend it on a new American car? No, I did not. I saved it. But until people realize that trickle down doesn't really help alleviate the national debt or deficit each year, we need to have more fair taxes, and corporates needs to pay their fair share.
Mr. Robling, how do Republican policies help the national debt?
Well, this is an area of big disagreement between Jan and myself, and I think that what you see with Donald Trump is an embrace of pro-growth strategies, so that he wants to grow the economy, and if you grow the economy the way that and there is more economic activity and more income, say for individuals, on which we're driving income taxes, then you're creating more revenue coming to government. And I think, notwithstanding Jan's quote from the 1980s, I believe that it's very clear that once the Reagan tax plan was in place, as the economy began to grow, there was increasing revenue to the federal government year on year throughout the 1980s. The problem in the 1980s was that Reagan accepted a deal with the Congress about other cuts that were to be made later, which cuts were never made, and that caused the imbalance. But I would say on the area of we've seen Trump's economic plan for corporations that has just come out in the last 4 or 5 days. That includes very significant cuts for corporations, so that this what they call technically an inversion, where the headquarters goes overseas, that those are limited, or that they're ended not through an exit tax, which is the Hillary Clinton approach, but by making the United States a more desirable place for corporate headquarters, like in this picture behind us, all these great big corporations. And we don't want them all to go to Ireland or Luxembourg or Switzerland or to a post office box in Geneva or wherever. We want them here. But for them to be here, we need to lower that. We need to make our corporate tax rate competitive with the world marketplace for corporate tax rates. That's probably more in the 15 to 20% range.
I'd like to comment on two things that Chris said. First of all, when you were talking about the Reagan tax cuts in the 80s, they obviously did not improve the economy, because Reagan also cut programs. He decimated Medicaid, he decimated many social programs, and he also left the economy in such bad shape that his successor, who was his vice president, Bush #1, had to raise taxes. He didn't want to, but he was left with this horrible economy that got worse over the 80s and early 90s, so he had to. And then when you talk about now with Donald Trump's promise of pro-growth economy, and he talks about 25 million new jobs, he never quite says how he's going to do that. How is he going to make these jobs and make them so that they pay a living wage, so that people start buying things again? I mean, look at the new generation. The millennials who graduate college now are saddled with college debt. They're not buying houses. And if you don't buy a house, you don't buy all the things that go in the house and outside the house. And that's what fuels our economy. So I don't know how he's going to do this. He's very light on the details. But when they tried to do this before, pro-growth by cutting taxes to the consumer, it didn't work.
Well, okay, so the gross national product is very well established from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and if you go back, Jan, and you look throughout the 1980s, you will see that the gross national product was increasing every quarter throughout the 1980s, that we had an economy that was growing about 1.5 to 2 times the rate of the economic growth that we've seen under President Obama.
But inflation was in the teens during that same time.
Inflation was in the teens for the first 2 years of the Reagan administration, during which Paul Volcker and President Reagan decided to wring inflation out of the economy. It was a very difficult time. Everybody understands that we had to go through that to get to actual growth. And in terms of decimating Medicaid, if you go back and you look, there is no time at which we've spent less in a given year on Medicaid than we had spent in the year before. So there was no, quote, decimation.
And social programs.
Yeah, social programs.
Because he cut welfare,
in fact,
cut food stamps and education.
And
he wanted to get rid of the Department of Education.
And people still want to get rid of the Department of Education, and there is a great rationale for getting rid of the Department of Education and for getting rid of a lot of other federal government departments. This is getting to the big philosophical difference between I would say Democrats and Republicans, and what role government plays in our economy and in our society.
Right.
And I think Republicans believe in a much more limited and a much more highly effective role. And I think Democrats have proven themselves over the years to believe in a much larger role, whether or not it is effective. Okay, so I'm not sure that we've got another 3 hours to discuss, but we can take that up next time we're together.
Well, believe it or not, we are actually out of time.
There you go.
And we can talk about the Reagan 80s another time. But I'd like to thank Chris Robling
Good to be with you.
and Jan Goldberg for an outstanding debate, and maybe we'll do this again sometime. This is TalkNado. My name is John Gelsomino. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.